March 1945. A German observer on the eastern bank of the Rhine lifts his field glasses and sees the last river line of Germany disappear. Not the far bank, not the road, not the American trucks, not the engineers dragging bridge sections toward the water. Just white. A low, oily, unnatural white that crawls along the river for mile after mile until the shoreline looks erased from the earth. He knows smoke. Every army in Europe knows smoke. A shell bursts. A pot burns. A grenade hisses in a ditch. A cloud appears. Does its small job. And then the wind takes it. This is different. This fog has shifts. It has supply. It has men feeding it. It has a schedule. It stretches farther than his eye can measure. And somewhere inside it, the American Ninth Army is preparing to cross the Rhine in daylight. His guns are ready. His maps are marked. His range tables are good. His optics are clean. But when the artillery office asks for corrections, he has almost nothing to give them. He can hear movement, engines, chains, boat ramps scraping against mud, voices carried over water, but he cannot turn sound into a target. And in modern war, that single failure can destroy an army's advantage faster than any bomb, because the Germans did not lose sight of the Americans by accident. They were blinded by a branch of the United States Army most soldiers barely respected. Not an armored division, not a famous infantry regiment, not a secret superweapon, a service, a quiet, unglamorous, underfunded service that had spent nearly 20 years learning how to manufacture weather. To understand why that German observer could not explain what was happening, you have to begin with a problem so old that armies stopped seeing it as a problem. A man in the open, in daylight, is easy to kill. That is the basic arithmetic of battle. Put him in a field at noon. Give the enemy binoculars, machine guns, and artillery, and courage stops being the deciding variable. The First World War made that arithmetic unbearable. Aerial observers could see columns forming behind the trenches. Artillery could reach roads that once felt safe. Machine guns turned short stretches of exposed ground into places men crossed only once. Armies adapted in the oldest ways available. They moved at night. They dug. They waited for rain. They crawled. They accepted that daylight belonged to the man who could see. After 1918, every major army understood the danger. But almost no one built an institution around solving it. Smoke was treated as a moment, not a condition. A quick screen for a crossing. A flash of cover for a tank. A few minutes of concealment before wind and sunlight ruined the effect. The Americans came at the problem from an awkward direction. Their chemical warfare service had survived the First World War with a reputation. Nobody wanted to celebrate. Gas had become politically and morally poisonous. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 pushed poison gas outside lawful use. Congress did not want to spend money on a branch associated with a weapon the country hoped never to use again. So the Chemical Warfare Service faced an unusual question. What does a gas service do when gas is no longer its future? The answer began in dull places. Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, training grounds in Oklahoma. Later, camps in Alabama where men learned work that did not produce heroic photographs. They did not look for a dramatic explosion. They looked for a machine that could take oil, air, water, and gasoline, and turn them into a controllable cloud that would not vanish after 1 minute. Not a puff. Not a trick. A screen. A working atmosphere. That difference mattered. A smoke shell can hide a man for a few breaths. A generator can hide a road for an hour. A line of generators can hide a harbor. A trained company with fuel, weather reports, radios, spare parts, and officers who understand wind can hide an entire battlefield. That is what other armies missed. They built smoke devices. The Americans began building a smoke service. The first serious machine was massive. The M1 mechanical smoke generator weighed roughly as much as a small car. Field soldiers often connected it with Standard Oil because the design work involved industrial petroleum expertise. It was ugly, heavy, and thirsty. Set it on firm ground, feed it fog oil, start the combustion, and it could throw a white petroleum mist into the air for as long as the fuel kept coming. But the M1 had a problem. It was not a soldier's tool. It was a harbor tool, a depot tool, a thing you parked. Then came the lighter generator, the M2. Standardized in 1944, small enough for a team to move, built for forward, area work, and capable of turning fog oil into the same dense white obscuration that made observers useless. It was not magic. It was droplet size. Petroleum mist, broken into particles small enough to scatter visible light, behaved less as smoke than as an artificial fog. The men operating it did not need to destroy an enemy gun. They only needed to break the relationship between the gun and the eye guiding it. That was the real weapon, not the cloud, the broken line of sight. The first great proof came south of Rome. Anzio, 1944. The Allied landing began with almost insulting success. On January 22nd, troops came ashore at Anzio and Nettuno against thin German resistance. For a brief moment, the road inland looked open. Then caution took over. The beachhead was consolidated instead of exploited. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring moved faster than the Allies expected, and within days German forces were closing around the perimeter. By February, the beachhead was a shallow bowl under enemy observation. The Alban Hills looked down on it. The roads could be watched. The harbor could be watched. The supply dumps could be watched. The hospitals, tents, bridges, crossroads, and ammunition stacks all lay within the reach of German guns. The Americans on the beachhead gave one of those guns a name: Anzio Annie. A Krupp railway piece with a shell large enough to make men feel as though the air had been struck by a building. The shell did not have to land directly on a position to ruin it. It could collapse trenches, flip vehicles, rip open storage areas, turn a road junction into a crater and a rumor. But even a monster gun still needed information. Where was the traffic? Where were the unloading points? Where had the repair crews moved? Which road was alive? Which building mattered? For that, the Germans depended on observation. And that was where the Chemical Warfare Service changed the battle. At first, the smoke around Anzio was mostly an air defense measure used around the port and anchorage. Then the method evolved. The 24th Decontamination Company and the 179th Smoke Generator Company helped build something more subtle than a black wall. A light haze, a controlled screen, thin enough that men beneath it could work, drive, unload, and move. Thick enough that a German observer on high ground could not pick a target out of the beachhead. That was the genius of it. The goal was not to blind everyone. The goal was to blind the enemy at the correct distance. Inside the haze, Americans could still function. Outside it, German optics failed. The smoke line grew into an arc around the port. Generator positions shifted with wind. Crews watched the weather. Fuel had to arrive. Machines had to be maintained. Every hour, the white curtain had to be remade before nature tore it apart. And once it worked, the effect was not cinematic. It was practical. Trucks moved with less terror. Ammunition was unloaded under a sky that no longer belonged completely to the hills. Patrols crossed ground that on a clear morning would have been a killing floor. German guns still fired. Men still died. Anzio was not saved by smoke alone, but German artillery had been forced from seeing into guessing. And guessing is expensive when your ammunition is limited and your target is moving. Imagine the frustration from the German side. The observers had height. They had maps. They had trained eyes. They had telephone lines to batteries hidden behind the ridges. They had every advantage a gunnery system is supposed to need. And still, where American movement should have been, they saw a white absence. That absence was not weather. It was American organization made visible, a supply chain wearing the shape of fog. But Anzio had one obvious limitation. The beachhead did not move. A harbor is a fixed problem. You can study the wind, place the machines, build fuel routes, repair the line, and treat the screen almost as a second roof. That did not prove the smoke service could follow an assault. A patrol is different. A river crossing is different. Engineers in the open, trying to build bridges while German observers sit on bluffs above them, are different. The test came in September 1944, on the Moselle River in eastern France. By then, Patton's Third Army had raced so far and so fast that fuel, trucks, and timing were becoming enemies of their own. The Moselle was the first serious barrier before the German frontier. At Dorno, the crossing attempt bled badly. German observation from the heights turned the river into a trap. The Americans had to try again at Arneville. This time the 5th Infantry Division had the 84th Chemical Company, and the division chemical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Levin B. Cottingham, understood what Anzio had taught. The question was no longer, can smoke hide a harbor? The question was, can it hide a crossing while the crossing is happening? The plan began with 12 M2 generators. Soon, as the problem sharpened, the number of available machines rose toward 48. The crews placed them according to the valley, the wind, the bluffs, and the river. This was not a theatrical curtain dropped in front of the Germans. It was more delicate than that. A forward or weather machine had to be tuned against a real landscape. The smoke had to drift through the Arneville defile. It had to cover approaches, boats, bridge sites, and engineer equipment. It had to block German eyes without suffocating the American work underneath it. At first, it worked. The infantry moved. The crossing area vanished from direct observation. Enemy artillery fell, but much of it was unobserved. Then the wind changed. The screen opened, and the Germans immediately punished the gap. Artillery struck exposed equipment and men around the bridging sites. That moment proved both the weakness and the value of the whole system. When the screen failed, the old war returned in minutes. When the screen came back, the Americans could work again. So the smoke men adapted. They moved generators closer to the river. They used embankments for cover. They put machines on both banks. They supplemented generators with smoke pots. They used observation posts and radio communication to patch the screen in real time. In the Moselle Valley, smoke from 2 generators only 100 yards apart could drift in opposite directions. That should have ruined the idea. Instead, it forced the doctrine to mature. By the second day, engineers were building. By the third, armor was moving across. The crossing became one of those battlefield achievements that look simple only after someone else has paid the price of making it possible. A division historian later gave the smokescreen almost complete credit for the success of the bridging effort. That is an extraordinary admission. Army histories usually spread credit carefully. Here, the conclusion was blunt. The bridges lived because the enemy could not see them clearly enough to kill them. This is the answer hidden inside the whole story. American patrols did not cross open ground in daylight because they had discovered a braver way to be visible. They crossed because visibility itself had been reorganized. The white wall moved with them. At Anzio, the fog had protected a fixed beachhead. At Arneville, it protected men in motion. And once that worked, the method became part of the Allied way of fighting across rivers, fortified lines, and open approaches. In February 1945, on the Saar, the 94th Infantry Division crossed near the west wall under smoke, brought forward by chemical troops. At the Roer, during Operation Grenade, assault battalions moved through cold water and shattered approaches, while smoke and artillery worked together to blind observation points. The details changed from place to place. The governing idea did not. In modern warfare, a gun without observation is not harmless, but it is crippled. A fortified line without accurate eyes loses its reach. An artillery system that cannot adjust becomes a machine for turning ammunition into noise. That is what the Americans had discovered. Not how to make men invisible in the fantasy sense. How to make enemy certainty collapse. And that raises the question the Germans themselves had to live with. Why could they not do the same thing? They had chemists. They had engineers. They had artillery doctrine as good as any in the world. They even had troops whose name meant fog troops, the Nebeltruppen. German manuals included smoke. German units used smoke shells, smoke rockets, smoke grenades, vehicle dischargers, and special munitions for obscuring pillbox vision. On paper, the German inventory was impressive. In practice, it was built around bursts, moments, local effects, tactical flashes. The Nebelwerfer itself became famous not as a fog machine but as a rocket launcher, remembered for its screaming volley more than for any persistent screen. The German army had smoke tools. What it lacked was the architecture that turns tools into a battlefield condition. A device is an object. A service is a promise. A service means trained companies exist before the emergency. A service means spare parts are accounted for. A service means officers understand not only chemistry, but meteorology and terrain. A service means fog oil is not an improvisation. It is a supply class that must arrive on trucks before daylight. A service means radio nets connect observation posts to men standing beside roaring generators. A service means someone has already written doctrine for how the cloud should behave. The Germans did not fail because they were too stupid to understand smoke. They failed because they had not made continuous obscuration a serious institutional habit before they needed it. By the middle of the war, that mistake was almost impossible to repair. Germany was starving for petroleum. Panzer divisions needed fuel. The Luftwaffe needed fuel. Synthetic plants were under attack. Romanian oil had become vulnerable. To run large, area fog screens the American way. The Germans would have needed enormous quantities of specialized oil burned, not in engines, not in aircraft, not in tanks, but in the air. That is a hard choice for a nation already losing the fuel war. But the deeper reason was cultural. German operational thought rewarded speed, boldness, initiative, and the commander who saw an opening and struck. American war, making at its strongest, rewarded systems, factories, checklists, standardization, specialist branches, truck routes. Boring solutions scaled until they stopped being boring. Manufacturing a low white haze for 58 hours over a river crossing was not glamorous. It did not produce a photograph of a general with a pistol. It did not look decisive from a distance. But it solved the oldest infantry problem in a way that personality could not. It allowed men to move, while the enemy watched the place where they should have been, and saw nothing useful. By March 1945, this American habit of organized obscuration reached its largest form, the Rhine. Operation Plunder. The planned Allied crossing north of the Roer. The British Second Army. The Canadian First Army Sector. And the American Ninth Army prepared for a river assault on a scale that belonged to the final collapse of Germany in the West. The Rhine was not just water. It was a symbol the Germans had spent centuries imagining as a boundary. It was wide. It was defended. It was watched. On the far bank were observation posts, artillery positions, infantry strongpoints, and officers who knew that if the Allies crossed in strength, the war in the West would no longer have a last great line. So a week before the assault, the shoreline began to vanish. Smoke generators opened along the western bank. British and American smoke troops fed the screen. For miles and miles, The river edge turned white. Not for a few minutes. For days. German commanders could still hear preparation. That was impossible to hide. A million-man army preparing to cross a major river does not become silent because fog is present. Trucks still moved. Guns still registered. Engineers still worked. Supplies still stacked up. But the exact detail disappeared. Where would the crossings be? When would the boats launch? Which road mattered? Which assembly areas were occupied? What were the engineers building right now? The Germans could guess. They could not reliably see. And that was the point. The smoke did not need to erase Allied preparation. It only needed to erase German confidence. At 1 o'clock in the morning on March 24th, the artillery began. In the American 9th Army sector, hundreds of guns opened on the eastern bank. Heavy bombers hit rear positions and airfields. The river was hammered by noise, flame, and steel. Under that violence, assault boats carried men across. Engineers moved behind them with the materials that turn an assault into a bridgehead. German soldiers on the East Bank later described being stunned by the bombardment. They saw flashes. They felt impacts. They understood that something enormous was happening. What they did not see clearly enough, soon enough, were the men and boats that mattered. The reported casualties for the initial 9th Army Rhine crossing were astonishingly low. 31 killed or wounded. 31. For a major assault river crossing in the last year of the Second World War, that number seems almost unreal. It was not because the Germans had no weapons left. They did. It was not because the Rhine had stopped being a military obstacle. It had not. It was because every part of the Allied system had converged at the moment of crossing. Artillery, air power, engineers, deception, logistics, and a white industrial fog that made German observation late, partial, and uncertain. A day later, Winston Churchill crossed the Rhine in an American landing craft to inspect the bridgehead. He came under shell fire near the far bank and had to be hurried away. The incident became one of those small human images history remembers. The old prime minister near the waterline, the last German shells still reaching, the river finally behind the Allies. But the quieter image matters more. The bridge under his route had been made possible by men the Germans could not properly see while they worked. That is the hidden verdict of the smoke service. It did not win the war by itself. No honest history should claim that. But it changed the terms under which guns, roads, rivers, and daylight operated. It turned visibility into something that could be supplied. It made observation a contested resource instead of a gift, the high ground automatically received. It proved that an army could manufacture a local climate, maintain it with fuel and discipline, and move men through it before the enemy's artillery system could recover. The Germans could understand the chemistry. They could name the smoke. They could describe the equipment. What they struggled to categorize was the institution behind it, an army branch that had taken a rejected, unfashionable problem from the 1920s and nursed it into a battlefield capability by 1945. A few dozen machines were never the real story. The real story was the decision to build companies around them, to train crews, to stock oil, to write manuals, to study wind, to give chemical officers a place in the planning room, to accept that sometimes the most important thing a battlefield service can do is make sure no one becomes famous for dying in the open. Look back to that German observer on the Alban Hills above Anzio. He had the height. He had the optics. He had the guns. He had trained spotters beside him and telephone lines behind him. 5 miles below, American trucks, patrols, stretcher parties, and ammunition handlers moved through a coastal plain that should have belonged to his artillery. But the white wall stood between his profession and its target. Not a miracle, not luck, not a weapon in the heroic sense. A service. Now look again at the Rhine. Another observer, another bank, another pair of binoculars, another battery waiting for corrections. The same white refusal spreading across the field of view. Between those two scenes sat 20 years of unfashionable work. Men at arsenals. Men hauling drums of oil. Men repairing valves. Men watching wind. Men standing beside engines whose job was not to kill, but to keep others alive long enough to cross. That is why the German answer was so often disbelief from inside their own system. Continuous fog as an industrial battlefield output barely had a category. They had built fog devices. The Americans had built a fog service, and when the war reached its final rivers, that difference became visible by making everything else disappear. The guns were still there. The observers were still there. The open ground was still there. But the killing geometry had been broken. The men crossed in daylight because the army had learned how to move the sky.